joining us today. I know a couple of people are still joining, so I will give another 1 to 2 minutes for everyone to get settled in and join. I think we can get started. And if somebody is joining, please admit them into the webinar.
Yeah, it sounds good. You guys can get started.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick intro. I'm Awais. I'm the head of managed services in KeyData, and we are specialized in IAM space. In short, we live and breathe identity. And with me, I have Eric. Eric Maass is a co-founder for Cloud Identity, one of the pioneer of identity as a service. Eric, over to you for a quick intro.
Yeah, thanks, Awais, and hello, everybody. Eric Maass here. As Awais mentioned, I've been in the identity space for over 2 decades now, a lot of that focused on cloud identity, and I'm super excited to share some of that with you guys here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. I think today we are going to talk about rethinking our cloud identity and practical strategies for highly regulated industries. And let's start with Eric. I know, Eric, you have vast experience in identity space, particular in cloud identity, right? Can you please share some journeys with us and with our audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thank you guys for having me today, and for the audience, I'm definitely looking forward to speaking with all of you. My journey in identity started over 2 decades ago at this point. I worked initially in the federal space, working for Department of Defense, some intel agencies, building out identity as a service, essentially before it was called identity as a service. We referred to it back in the day as net-centric computing. Today, we would ultimately just say, hey, that was private cloud computing. That was the kind of the early vestiges of what became cloud computing. It was focused on multi-tenancy and how do we essentially stop a myriad of agencies building out their own infrastructure because of a lot of the challenges we're going to talk about today. And then when I left that part of my career and transitioned into the commercial space, I noticed that there were a lot of commonalities between small, medium, and very large organizations who were trying to build out their identity programs. It was interesting because they were all struggling with a lot of the same challenges, maybe at a different level, right? Or a different level of complexity based upon the organization's size and the vertical that they were in. And I quickly realized that the model that we had started to build out inside of the DoD was going to be applicable to the commercial space. And I started a business. We started to essentially focus on what's now referred to as cloud identity and access management. And from there, a lot of history, right? I ended up selling that business to a large tech company and spent a lot of time thereafter helping that organization address identity and access management in the cloud for its clients. So yeah, Awais, I've got a lot of history in this space, and it's certainly exciting to sit with you today and chat about it.
That's awesome. Thanks, Eric. I think if I'm not mistaken, there was a terminology that was being used at that time. Was it net-centric computing or something that?
Yeah, net-centric computing, because I guess at the time that the cloud wasn't really a thing, but it was this concept of, it's funny, that our industry seems to go in cycles, right? You start with, kind of shared computing with mainframes and so forth and terminals. Then we went to desktop software and client server, and then we went full circle all the way back to shared computing models again here. But yeah, net-centric computing, yeah, prior to the term cloud, I guess, becoming more of a hot term.
Yeah, no, thanks. I know there's a lot to digest for me and for my audience as well. So let's talk about some of the challenges with the conventional identity approach, and that has been transitioned to or led to this identity as a service, right? So what are the common challenges, Eric, you see within the industry?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we probably have a lot to unpack there. So let's just pick one and start with it, which is maybe one of the more obvious ones, which is just the complexity of the infrastructure. Um, it's somewhat underestimated, especially by organizations who are first kind of diving into the deep end of the pool of building out their first identity and access management programs. But um, the software, for better or worse, is fairly complex. I guess for better, when you think about it from a business value perspective, capability in this space has been evolving over decades, right? So, the concept of authenticating, authorizing, provisioning, entitlements management. I mean, this stuff has been around since the dawn of computing. So we've had a long time to improve upon the way identity and access management software works, but with that has come a lot of complexity. So infrastructure has essentially become anything but simple, especially for organizations in a small or mid-size kind of capacity looking to deploy some of the leading technologies for the first time. So that's maybe one of the first places of ways that I would say we see a lot of clients initially struggle, which is just, wow, where do I begin? There's a lot of moving parts and pieces to building out infrastructure, especially when you start thinking about like high availability and BCPDR. So
Yeah, I echo 100% with you on this one. And I have an interesting perspective as well on this one. You know, when we talk about hardware, right? So we also talk about a lot of upfront capital investment, right? That cannot be ignored with this conventional approach, right? Procuring hardware, right? And based on one of the real world story that I can just put it out for audience and you, we started procuring the hardware. Everything was there, right? And then the team realized that in order to implement active HA, like high availability active, right, we don't have any GTM, right? So now the procurement of that GTM load balancer between two data center took another 3 months. So I agree with you that there is a lot of complexity involved in setting up the infrastructure. Plus, I think there is a potentially a lot of upfront capital investment, right? Not only limited to infrastructure, but like procuring software licenses, right? Hiring an integration services partner to implement those services, and then eventually sustainment cost to hire full-time resources to support that system during the project and after project as well. So if someone spends in millions on setting up the IAM platform, when we should expect the return on investment, right? That's the piece that everyone thinks very difficult to answer when the real ROI will come, right?
Yeah, and I guess maybe the cynical answer is never soon enough. Maybe I'll start with that. And this is, again, part of the reason why, over a span of, as I said, at least a couple of decades here in this space, um, I've unfortunately seen a lot of identity programs fail, and some of them may have eventually succeeded, but the term eventually is probably the key term in that sentence, because as you just spelled out, when do we see value realization? There's a significant disconnect between, a CISO who says, I've got budget, we're ready to pull the trigger, we're going to go build out this identity program, and then the very lengthy span of time between kicking that off and when the business actually realizes value. So when we look at everything that needs to be done, right, and you hit upon a couple of those, right? There's vendor evaluations, often proof of concepts, there's bake-offs, there's procurement processes, there's provisioning of hardware, there's infrastructure build out, there's, as you mentioned, typically maybe a service integrator who's coming in, there's process development, right? So if you're a small to mid-sized organization, this could still be a half a year or more, right, of effort. I've seen some large organizations at it for multiple years before they're hitting the point where things are finally starting to chug along and they've got some basic provisioning and onboarding processes and so forth. But depending upon the organization and their tolerance for that, a lot of programs have failed simply because somebody in the C-suite has said, we're not getting the value that we expected from this, and the dollars get pulled or they get scaled back, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling, kind of prophecy, a death spiral, if you would. So unfortunately, value realization is much further down the line with on-premise deployments than a lot of organizations would like.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with your perspective. The only thing that I wanted to highlight from my perspective is also when you do a lot of capital investment, you need to show some capitalization around the licenses after a year. I've seen a lot of companies getting into order troubles when they bought the licenses, but then were not being able to capitalize on those licenses, right? And it completely changed the dynamics of program from showcasing the value to defending the capitalization, right? So at one point you say, oh, this program is going to add a greater value to our organization or enterprises. And at one point, then you start defending the cost associated with the capitalization of licenses, infrastructure, and sometimes dual system overhead cost also contribute a lot, right? So they have a legacy system that they need to support, so on. So I agree that there is no end to this value realization portion to it. So when we talk about this, right? So I know we talked about this earlier, that there are multiple procurement cycles involved as well. So do you think that that also contribute to an extensive operational cost involved in down selecting multiple technologies, vendors, integration service providers?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. I mean, procurement is sometimes really good at their job, and they're often they're often going after cutting the best deals and best terms and so forth for an organization. But it's sometimes a really lengthy process in and of itself, and you may be dealing with multiple vendors, as you mentioned, a software vendor, maybe a system integrator, maybe multiple software vendors, right? You've got hardware to procure. Maybe there's data center, terms that need to be updated, more capacity or space that's needed somewhere. Um, we've seen some really ugly kind of procurement issues during an identity program stand up all the way through. I mean, and this is maybe more applicable to a large organization, but a client I had back in the day who needed MPLS circuits installed at a data center for dedicated capacity because again they were concerned about bandwidth and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity, I guess, the ways I guess that could be added even with the procurement cycle alone. But yeah, all of those logistical aspects are often underestimated. And I think you hit the nail on the head with things like, is there a return on investment and showing by an audit that you've put those licenses to use and so forth. That's a really good point as well. And again, some of those things that are not thought about early on when you're kind of in, kind of a greenfield mode and just kicking off.
So what's the solution to this perceived complexity, Eric, right? Like, I know for small organization, right? So when they hear a lot of these challenges with an enterprise grade identity, right? So there must be some solution that can avoid these all challenges that we discussed.
Yeah, I mean, the right solution is looking at identity delivered as a service. So at this day and age, right, it's almost maybe a little bit expected, right? There's X as a service has been infiltrating almost every area of our lives at this point. But there was a point when identity as a service was really a far-flung idea. And I can remember those days, in fact, the mid 2000s or so, when we were just getting started in my company building this out. I had more than one conversation with a CISO who kind of looked at me like I had three heads and and laughed us out of the room. I'm not putting my crown jewels, up in the cloud or in a service, blah, blah, blah. And I can't tell you the ones who came back 24 months later, 36 months later. It was interesting to watch the process because there were millions of dollars that were spent in some of these cases that were thrown into a black hole before there was a realization that said, yeah, this is complicated. And a lot of that complexity for the reasons we mentioned, but also because of things like skills. Skills are hard to come by. And, you and I have just been chatting about how long it might take to get some of these programs off the ground. People who come and go, right? Hey, we thought we had the right people. We trained people up. Oh, sorry, that guy just took a new job. He's moved on. So the longevity of these programs as well also has an implication on the skills and the way in which you have to manage skills and make sure you're constantly building a pipeline, training, retaining, those skills, which is not easy, right? It's not easy for a big company, but it's certainly not easy for a small to mid-sized organization as well. But identity as a service, Awais, I think that's where that's where the answer lies.
Yeah, that's great insights, right? But when we talk about identity and service, right, can you please highlight what it means to our audience and who can leverage it and what type of value proposition is associated with it, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess the easiest way to look at it is a lot of the value proposition is directly aimed at addressing the problems that we've just been discussing, right? So I can speak from personal experience, right? When I first decided to build an identity as a service business, back in the day, it wasn't because it was something dreamt up in a vacuum where I said, we're going to try and force this model on the world, right? We think this is just the thing to do, right? Just the opposite. It was driven by the conversation that you and I have just been having here, and numerous customers who I had to visit time and time and time again who said, this is going wrong, that's going wrong, this is broken, that's failed, right? And I said, there just has to be a better way. So identity as a service really is designed to help reduce those upfront capital expenses. A lot of businesses just, for better or worse, right? They're not going to go allocate, what could be hundreds of thousands to potentially millions of dollars in upfront capital. The complexity is often daunting, as we've been discussing, for infrastructure deployment, the whole process and logistics around it, right? Um, and the ability to predict outcomes, because most companies, unless they're in the tech space, right, this is a means to an end. Identity and access management is there to help provide a business service for them. They need to ensure that people are onboarded and offboarded and entitlements are properly handled. And they're worried about that auditor who's going to come in and find that, oh, geez, you never deprovisioned this particular person after they left the company and they've had entitlement to a critical application and now you failed some type of audit. That's what they're after. All of this other stuff, this is just the noise in the system that keeps them from getting to that business goal. So identity as a service is really there to help create a predictable outcome and get organizations to go focus on what they're really after, which is the benefit, the business benefit of identity, and not, be in the business of becoming a tech management company themselves, right? So lowered costs, it could be as low as 50%, off of what they're going to be paying for an on-prem type of, end-to-end solution, if you would. So there's very appealing financials to it. And then also getting them to that value realization that we've been talking about. When organizations decide that they want to get into this space, they don't want to wait 2 years to see results. They don't even want to wait, sometimes, 6 months, right? So the idea that you can get them there much quicker, lower cost, predictable outcomes, it's a highly attractive type of value proposition.
Awesome. So that means that they are getting all in one subscription model, right? Where licenses is included, one-time implementation is included, and sustainment, but they are paying based on the subscription model from the day one. I think that's very appealing, right? But when we talk about industries, right? So I think it might be more beneficial for mid to small businesses with budget constraint, right? Or do you think that, what are the typical organization would be interested in ISAS?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I could tell you, when I first got involved in this space, the organizations that immediately saw the need were definitely highly regulated businesses who said, we have, tough constraints around what we're trying to do. But they were on the small to mid-size, right? Because some of the larger, highly regulated organizations, at least in the early days, they had the manpower, they had the ability and the capital to go spend, right? They could tolerate the long, kind of investment, return on investment cycles that we've been talking about. But that quickly kind of bubbled up as well too. So sitting here today in 2025, um, it's definitely regulated industries that are going to benefit most from the business outcomes. But we've now seen this kind of span all the way from SMB through large enterprise who has actively been adopting an identity as a service model, right?
Right. So could you give us some of the real world stories where it has been successful in the past?
Yeah, I love the war stories, so we can definitely talk about some of those. So I'm going to refrain from naming names, of course, but one of our very first customers back when I was doing this in the mid 2000s was a small insurance company. They had a very minimal IT staff, and they were concerned about some of the lack of focus that they had around identity management. They called us in to come take a look, point out what was working, what wasn't working. We did that. We gave them a very thorough report and said, here's what we think you should do. And then we put two proposals in front of them. We put a proposal for an on-premise classical, identity management system that was going to help address a lot of the needs that they had. Again, they were in a highly regulated space, so there wasn't a lot of wiggle room to say yes or no. We're going to not do this, or so forth, right? They had to walk that line. And then we put a service model agreement in front of them, which, as we've just been talking about here, right, did things like reduced their upfront capital and removed a lot of the wait time that they were going to have. It most importantly for them, because they looked around their organization and said, if we built this out and we had to manage it on-prem, even if we were willing to take the time and spend the money, we just don't think we can attract and retain the talent that we need. And we're going to have to build out multiple data centers with this. And as you were discussing, Awais, right, where you have to start thinking about things like syncing data between data centers for high availability and so forth. And they said, we just don't have these skills. So they were one of our first kind of early adopters who dove into that service model, and it worked out fantastically for them. They were with my company to the day that I sold the company. On the other end of the spectrum, right, we've had extremely large organizations the automotive space, the manufacturing space, the retail space, a lot of home recognizable names. Again, I can't name them here on this call, but suffice it to say, anybody listening to this call would know the names of these businesses. They're Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of the value that they were after was very much aligned. And this is why I said it's kind of interesting to see, someone like a small insurance company struggle with the same challenges that a Fortune 500 did. In the case of those Fortune 500s that joined us, they had the ability to do it the traditional way. They just did the math and they looked at the problem and they said, why would we at the end of the day, right? So they looked around and they said, for those people who we could be allocating to go focus on building infrastructure and managing this, sustaining this complex infrastructure, going through that lengthy deployment, right? And then operationally dealing with that, we could take those same people and repurpose them to start delivering higher business value on top of the identity system. So for a lot of them, that was the key thought process that they had to go through, which was the value makes sense. Yes, we could do it this way, and they had to break the mindset of how they would have traditionally approached it, and then decide to elevate the way in which they were using their own staff to start, accelerating the value on top of the identity program. Oh, those people who would be otherwise fiddling with, integrating workflows and stuff like that, they could now be focused on business process, talking to our HR department, talking to our application teams, and determining what those onboarding processes should look like, right? So they focused much more on business process engineering versus fiddling with the janitorial aspects of how to make software work below the covers, right?
This is my mandate at KeyData as well. I think, Eric, you spoke my mind, right? So I always tell them that, business should focus on what matters the most for them without worrying about identity lifecycle management. We at KeyData will take care of those identity security needs, right, as a service. Yeah, I think you highlighted a very good points regarding the past success. So if I summarize that I think this offering can work for potentially smaller organization where the most effective is where the organization couldn't afford, enterprise identity grade level grade products previously, but now they have an access to with the lower total cost of ownership. Whereas larger organization can also refocus on the business value, right? So that's great discussion. Um, I think when we were talking about these, right, is there any aspect that you would like to share with us, or any service offering that stand out at the time when you were delivering the service, identity as a service?
Yeah, I mean, they were early competitors, but like I said before, um, a lot of them were very focused on the low-hanging fruit. So, if you think about the way identity as a service evolved, it was very much kind of focused on first extending on-prem systems. So you saw, early players in this space look to extend on-prem identity systems by offering things like, federated single sign-on to SaaS applications and cloud applications and so forth. One of the interesting things that you guys are doing here, is really focusing on the hard stuff. Identity governance and the idea of managing, as you just said, the identity lifecycle, that's way more complicated than just, hey, I'm going to help you, bridge the gap and sign your, employees into cloud applications. Okay, that was an early need back in the day. But this is the hard, ugly stuff, right? The complicated stuff, because not only is it more infrastructurally complicated and a longer, process to set up all of that stuff, but it also comes with a lot more complex business processes. So yeah, I would say there were plenty of kind of early players, some of which are still in the space, some of which have, gotten out of the space. But the interesting stuff that's happening now in this realm, I really believe is where you guys are starting to focus, which is the governance side and provisioning side and lifecycle management side of identity. That's the hard part, right?
Yep.
So
No.
do you think Awais is from your perspective, is identity as a service right for everybody? Is it something that you would otherwise recommend across the board?
Yeah, I believe so. It's effective. As I said earlier, right? It is effective for smaller organization who's lacking capacity and skill, like you said, that this is a niche field, right? Retaining resources is a hard part, right? And if the program is spanned over the years, right, one or two, right, it's difficult that if somebody leaves, you need to backfill with the knowledge of the entire program, which is very hard, right? So
Yeah.
that's why I think that identity as a service is a solution for both smaller and larger organization, and specifically for larger organization who wanted to be compliant and focus on the business value, right? So in my 2 cents, yes, it is more relevant to both smaller and larger.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's like I said before, it was more of an imperative initially, especially for some of those early adopters back in the day who decided to kind of, roll the dice, if you would. But the space has evolved now, and it's much more of a mainstream concept, especially since you're seeing the broad adoption, even up into those regulated larger organizations. So, yeah, I completely agree with that. So, maybe you can, tell me a little bit about what you guys are doing at KeyData. What's your service offering look like these days?
Yeah, we recently launched our ISAS program in partnership with SailPoint, right? So the mandate is to offer all-in-one subscription model for as an identity as a service. So this includes software licensing, one-time implementation, and sustainment of this IAM program as well. So we're trying to aim to get our clients up and running within 6 to 8 weeks, right? So that they don't have to do upfront capital investment that we talk about. They don't have to stand up the complex infrastructure. They don't have to hire or go to procurement life cycle to onboard some integration service provider who can do the implementation, and then hire in-house people or outsource that platform for somebody to sustain. So what we are offering is ISAS is a combination of all, where licenses is included, software is included, implementation is included, and sustainment at a monthly subscription cost. And the reason we came up with this offering is that we wanted to make our customers successful with setting up the platform up and running within 6 to 8 weeks, and then over the period of time we can build on top as well, right? So this is eventually our aim is.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, if you talk to um, a lot of CISOs who have been through this, right, and they have their own war stories, 6 to 8 weeks, a lot of them have just begun to figure out like the basics of how they're going to get up and running, to get procurement moving, right, to get hardware, right, as all the things we've been talking about. So the idea that you guys are getting customers live in 6 to 8 weeks, that's just blazing fast these days.
I know. So I have seen that when the IM programs start, it might take 6 to 8 weeks to close the design, right? To close
Yeah,
the
yeah,
requirements, right? So whatever offering is actually focused on the business value, right? So joiner, mover, lever is a process across same processes across all the enterprise organizations. So when I start talking about back into 2000s, right, the process of joiner, mover, lever hasn't changed significantly, right? And, having those multiple design session requirement workshop, etc., I think that complicates too much. So what we came up with is standard reusable design, which is standard in a nature, where enterprises doesn't have to think too much into the depth that how it should work. We came with the best practices and with the reusable design of joiner, mover, and lever with birthright access And we set that up within initially 6 to 8 weeks, and then we can build anything on top of it. If some customers want access certification, we can build on top of it. Over the period of sustainment, if we would like to onboard multiple more application, we can do that as well.
Now that's fantastic. And it's something, maybe we haven't talked enough about here as we've been having this chat, but the idea that you're baking in the experience. It's not just like, hey, we're going to outsource your infrastructure and stuff. We've been focused a lot on that part of the discussion, but what you just said, I think, Awais is really key, because the idea that, an organization like KeyData, you've been there, you've seen it, you've seen what works, you've seen what doesn't work, and now you're institutionalizing that knowledge into the onboarding process and helping clients build out those joiner, mover, lever processes. Um, Again, it's another area where the trial and error for organizations who are rolling the dice and doing their own thing on-prem, even if you make it past the gauntlet of all the challenges we've mentioned before, business process is complicated, right? As you mentioned, what should birthrights look like? What entitlements should or shouldn't be, adopted from Active Directory, right? These are questions that you see the wheel reinvented over and over and over again when you visit customers. And the fact that you guys are baking that into the way in which you're delivering the service, I think that's genius, because it's another major failure point, and you're helping to take that off the table for your clients. So, when your customers get up and running after this 6 to 8 week process, can you elaborate a little bit, what the offering looks like, once you're in kind of a sustainment mode? What happens from that point forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think a lot of our customers says that, well, once we are up and running, does it means that we are now in run and operate mode, right? So the way that we design our ISS delivery model is a next generation model to meet the evolving needs of the business, right? So our main mandate is not just to keep the lights on, which is very traditional in managed services, right? So when you go to some organization asking them, this is the product that you guys have to support, and these are the SLAs, right? So they come with the mandate, which is run and operate, right? Part of our ISS offering, we provide development capabilities, right? And which means that it's not only limited to run and operate or keep the lights on, which means that you are set for the basics in first 6 to 8 weeks, like joiner, mover, lever, the task, but you can continue to build on top of that, which means that you can onboard multiple downstream system over part of our sustainment, right? And you can implement new features which wasn't there, or you were, or it was on your inspiration list to do that. And we can do overall platform enhancement throughout our engagement, right? It's not like one-time implementation, which means that after 6 to 8 weeks, there is an end to a development, right? So we came with this idea that to meet the business need, we will continue to improve their platform to meet those business evolving needs, right?
Yeah, no, that's another key area. I'm so glad to hear that you guys are doing that, because again, there's a misperception, and I remember it was, geez, have to think back how long ago this was. Gartner does their Identity and Access Management Summit each year, and I have to think back, it was maybe 10 years ago now, I want to say, that the keynote was all about how identity and access management is a program and not a project, right? So, a lot of misconception there as well too, by organizations who, especially the traditional on-prem approach, right, where there's a budgeting cycle and the CISO goes, okay, how much money do we need? They go to their underlings, their key people, and say, how much money do you need? And the dollar figure gets materialized and gets, and even if they're successful with all that, right? What you just said is another part of the equation that's often missing, because it's not thought of as a program, which is your needs change. And more than likely, as you just said, your initial deployment is not, you're not biting off everything, right? you're going after those key systems that are keeping you up at night. They're going to cause you to fail an audit. They're, your major concerns for, like we said, your birthright entitlements, your termination, needs, whatever it may be, right? That's your top of mind. But yeah, far too many organizations miss the fact that this is a living, part of your IT infrastructure now. It's a living part of your business processes. Every time something changes with human resources or it changes with your downstream applications or AD, there's needs that have to change. So it sounds like you guys have really thought about that and you're planning for the way in which you're delivering this service to be evolving with your clients and not just treating them as, static deployments that, nothing changed after the last 3 years, right? Since we went
Absolutely. And
live.
I have seen, Eric, a lot of deployments which take a lot of time, that by the time that those projects goes live, there is a fast forward upgrade project waiting for them, because when they started, the product release was 8.1. When they finish, they are already close to end of support or end of life, right? So they,
Yeah.
they start a new project, just to catch up with the latest releases. So that this idea is an amazing idea where, we are on the evergreen plan, right? Like you said, that this is a program, right, that will run for a long time. It's not like a one-off project. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
the vision.
I think that's great too, because clients, as we said earlier, this is about not just expediting outcomes, but it's about predictable, outcomes as well. And I think there's a sense of comfort when a client can say, we know that these changes are going to take place, but we have a predictable mechanism now. This contract vehicle that we have with our service provider accounts for that these changes are taking place, right? So it helps with the procurement cycles. It helps them to avoid, those big, like you said, kind of fast follow, projects that try going back again, to your CISO or whomever holds the money, right, and saying, "Oh, I know we just got done, as you just said, but we built on a version that's now into life because it took us, 18 months to get there," right? I think that's fantastic. It
I,
really
I'm
helps to
actually
eliminate that, concern. Sorry,
I'm
go ahead.
actually glad that you brought predictability, right? So I think it's one of the biggest factor that why our clients love our services is the cost predictability, right? When you go into ISaaS, your cost is fixed based on the subscription, right?
Yeah.
But when you go with the traditional managed services, the project goes, beyond the timelines. There is a budget overruns, right? And even scope creeps, right, et cetera, and all that stuff, right? I've often seen that, a lot of organization, they do an upfront implementation with a very low cost, but then they use the multiple procurement cycle with change requests, work orders, and ultimately their unplanned cost is higher than their planned cost, right? So
Yeah.
I think one of the beauty of this offering is that we are getting a predictable cost over the period of the entire program without worrying us to have multiple procurement cycles for those change in work orders.
Yeah, that's a small, nuanced, but very important, kind of difference that you just mentioned there. Because yeah, that's a common, unfortunately common aspect of, kind of the yesteryear managed services approach. Like you said, follow on change orders and stuff like that. And eventually the customer goes bankrupt and they can't afford it, right? And it's, not technically bankrupt, right? But same thing we said about on-prem deployments, where eventually somebody pulls the plug and says, it reminds me of maybe it was calculus and limit functions and stuff like that. And I remember the professor, at one of my classes, saying it's kind of like you're walking halfway every day. You never get there, right? And that's what some of these projects look like. They look like limit functions to me, right? You walk halfway every day, but you never reach your goal. So um, yeah, I think that's fantastic again that you guys have thought about that, because it really helps to avoid the downstream sticker shock and the unfortunate event of somebody eventually pulling the plug because we've never reached the goal, right? and there's always something else to change now. So I guess Awais, if people wanted to learn more about this, what are you guys doing to help them, kind of figure out, if they wanted to kind of dig deeper into what you guys are doing?
I think my team has created an amazing job just to create a TCO calculator. It's accessible on our website. If somebody wants to go into the services, they can figure it out. That TCO actually help organization to understand that how much total cost of ownership that they can save by going to this model, right? And it's pretty straightforward, right? So
Awesome.
I think they can also submit a quick request for a quick quotation as well. So, I mean, we can help with understanding how this work for their specific business needs. And our team will get in touch with them if they can fill out that form. And I know, we have 15 minutes left. I just wanted to take this opportunity to have a Q&A session as well. Thank you, Eric, for joining us today. But our to audience, if there are any questions, happy to answer.
I think there was a question in the chat from Shozib. How much changes we would expect for JML and how much we can cope with those changes after a design? And do we support services which are not directly available by vendors?
I think that's a very good question. So what we did is we didn't benchmark those processes as a hard processes to follow, right? So when we designed that, there is still a flexibility where the client can tell that, okay, my account in Active Directory should get created 5 days prior to start date. So those are flexible configurations, or my person part of joiner lever, right? So when joiner the account get active on the day when when the person starts. So those are all configurable items. But we talk about when reusable artifact is basically the joiner process is not going to change, right? It comes from an HR, it goes to an Active Directory, all those downstream systems, right? So we came up with the pre-developed design for joiner mover levers that everyone can adopt to their flexibility. There are configurable items which customer can leverage. I have one customer who said that we have mainframe system which requires a prep, right? So can you configure the system where the Active Directory account get activated 5 days prior to join date? So we make sure that he is in the mainframe system. And yes, we can modify those. So there is no hard and fast rule that they have to strictly follow those developed process. It is basically a framework that can be modified and tuned in to meet the business needs.
A ways I'm going to just chime in as well. So I'm not from KeyData, so I won't speak about your service. But what I will add to that is, aside from the fact that it makes sense that you have these flexible joiner mover lever processes, some of the most successful customers that we ever saw, not just with identity as a service, but even on-prem, because the concept, can transition between the two. The most successful customers that we've seen in the IGA space were those who came to us and said, we don't want to do something stupid, if I'm just honest about it, right? So some of the smartest CISOs, they understood that they had archaic processes that were developed for random, strange reasons that had become, written in stone in their organization. And if you simply take what you're doing today and say, I need it to work verbatim this same way tomorrow, maybe that works. Maybe it's successful. If it's efficient and it was well developed and all of the right reasons were behind it. But if it's a 20-year-old process that is long outdated and is not following industry best practices, I think that's a great opportunity for clients who, when they're coming to an organization like KeyData, and you guys have been there, done that, seen that with a lot of different organizations, a lot of different customers, there's a huge opportunity to learn from that and update those processes to be more efficient and to use best practices versus just try to put a square peg in a round hole, as they say, right?
That's great. Do we have any other questions from audience?
As of right now, no, there is no more questions. So it's up to you guys. Um,
So I think, Eric, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was very valuable information for me as well, learning about, how you have done. And I completely echo when I came with this idea as well at the start, right? So there were a lot of questions, right? In there and I can hear you, right? Those challenges within the organization and external, that how we sell this, how we approach this, how we bundle it up, how we price that, etc., and all that stuff. But the but if we think about the success of our customer, right? If we try to address the problem right, which we laid down, I think that make a significant difference, right? And what we try to do is to address those complex problems that we talk about today with something that we can offer all in one subscription. And that was the mandate, to help our customer to resolve those complex issues that they are facing,
yeah.
part of their IM journey. And I'm really thankful for you to come and join me on this webinar to share your expertise. And with that, I think we can give 10 minutes back as well. Do you have any last comments, Eric?
No, I appreciate it as well, Awais. I guess all I can say is, imparting on the audience here, to consider, such a model. I'll leave you with one last kind of war story from my time in this space. I still remember, it was a CISO from, a very recognizable brewery company, here in the United States, and he said to me, he said, Eric, we make and we ship beer. That's what we do. That's what our company does. And he recognized from the get-go, again, this was a huge company. They could have afforded to do anything they wanted to, right? But he recognized that there was no value proposition in him dedicating the time, the energy, the effort, the personnel, the training, the headaches, everything that went with that. This was a company that had over 120 SAP instances that needed to be provisioned. And he was just looking at a very daunting, process of doing that on-prem. And it was something similar to what you guys are talking about here today, getting them up and running quick, getting them to the value realization. And those were the happiest types of customers, right? Because they hit their goal, they reached it predictably, as we've been talking about. They saved money along the way doing it. And then they were happy to do things like show up at conferences with us and speak about those experiences. And I'm just glad to see you guys have, really taken the thinking to the next level here in terms of, baking in your expertise, baking in the way in which you're thinking about the business processes and stuff. So yeah, fantastic ways. Thank you for having me, and thanks, to the audience here for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.